Hi, I'm David Cobb,
And I'm Adrian Klein.
and this is Wide Angle with Photo Cascadia. So, welcome to the newest episode of Wide Angle with Photo Cascadia, and we are going to be talking about photographing details and abstracts today. And if you found us on YouTube, welcome. And if you have come over from our blog, welcome. But if you're new on YouTube, Photo Cascadia has been around for 11 years now, and we have been curating this blog. We have video blogs, we have audio blogs, and written blogs that have been around for about 11 years now. So come check us out at photocascadia.com. Now, Adrian, you are the detail guy. Every time I am out in the landscape, you're looking at a small scene, and it's just uh, amazing how you find these things. Tell me a little bit about that and what you look for in the larger landscape to find the smaller detail scene.
Yes, you're right, David. I definitely like photographing the details or the art in nature. It's something that I really enjoy, and I find it very fascinating when I find that right composition that makes me want to photograph it. Um, it's it can be very difficult to find the right composition. It definitely takes time. Setting up a landscape shot, sometimes it's just planting the tripod and taking a picture and you're done. With the details, you're constantly hunting around looking for that right scene. And it's very easy to get distracted by the much bigger picture of everything else around you. It's basically like a lot of noise. And so the question is really like, how do you get rid of the distractions or the noise to go focus in on those details? A good tip that I use personally, and what I used early on that I would suggest, is putting on your telephoto lens. A lot of my images are photographed with my telephoto lens, my 70 to 200, for example, and that helps, clear a lot of that out.
I was going to ask you what lenses you use. I tend to use a telephoto and a macro too. And I think when I'm looking for a detail shot, I can remember in this large landscape I was in with Christian Heeb, I was in the Badlands, and he was photographing this larger landscape, and I just zeroed into this dried out frog in the mud and this line cutting through it. So I found that fascinating. To me, that's fascinating. And, as you said, you're looking for those smaller scenes. They're hard to find, but tell me kind of what you're looking for. I think you have a yin and yang approach to your photography sometimes. You have this light and dark scene, you're playing off warmth and coolness in color and other things too. Tell me a little bit about what you look for.
Definitely. Yeah, there is the yin and yang approach, more the minimalist or simple approach of just the dark and the light or the different colors. Beyond that, it's patterns, looking for something that kind of represents some patterns, uh, textures, the various from, that within even the same image. So might have a more glossy sheen versus a rough. Maybe rust is something that's been very interesting for me. You have an old rusty part of the image and then something else that's much more colorful and shiny. I find that interesting. So the contrasting elements. A lot of it also is lines. Very interesting to try to find the different lines and how they might create different either shapes or just symmetry within the image.
Yeah, and you're also great at picking out scenes in chaos. So there's two images that I know for sure that you've taken in chaos. One, there's a forest way, way in the distance, and
Yep.
you zoomed in on that forest for a smaller scene by using that telephoto lens. But there's another one also in a forest where you're walking down a trail and you found a really cool pattern on a trunk of a tree that had fallen. But again, chaos everywhere, and you were able to pick out those two things. So, how do you look for that?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the one the one with the telephoto lens that you're talking about, that was in the Tetons, And that is one of my favorites. I was standing there on an overcast day. There's really not much to photograph. There was nothing compelling or moving me from a landscape perspective. And I just said to myself, there must be something here off in the distance, is really what I said. And I had the time. And so I continued to just look off in the distance. And again, that telephoto lens that I referenced earlier on is exactly what I did. I put that on and scanned the landscape. And within a matter of minutes, I saw something that really jumped out at me. And so that's how that one came about. And the other forest scene, I was literally just wandering and looking down. I think so often we get caught up in looking at everything up above us. And there also can be great scenes, even from a, abstract or art in nature from that perspective. But a lot of times just looking down you're going to find what you're after. And in that case, I saw this big log and the patterns were sticking out. It just jumped at me and said, I know there's something here. And I spent the next half hour photographing that area.
Yeah. And you and I are looking down a lot. We love the details. We like that smaller scene. I think it's also important if you utilize that focal plane and try to keep parallel to your subject matter, because then you can get sharpness throughout. If you've got that camera angled
Agreed.
a little bit, you'll get part of it out of focus and part of it in focus. With a macro flower shot, I might say that could be good, because if you want your stem to fall off into nothingness, that is a technique you can use to do that. But with these kind of scenes, patterns on the beach or rocks, you're the rock man. So you love rocks, you love photographing rocks, but you've got that focal plane down. So talk about that when you're setting up for some of those scenes on the beaches and things.
Yeah, it is a valid point, and I always want to make sure that my image is sharp all the way around for these type of images. It doesn't work if it's going to be soft along the sides. Often I'm selling my work as very large prints. In fact, one of them that we're talking about today recently printed as a 4 foot by 6 foot image, and if I didn't have it sharp all the way around, it wouldn't work. Usually I'm going with f/22. And again, keeping that focal plane basically the same all the way through. And that helps minimize it. If it's different angles, I mean, yes, you can get into the whole thing where you're dealing with focus stacking and all of that. I want to minimize my time that I'm processing things later. So I try to do as much as I can in the field to get the sharpest image possible.
And with those rock scenes, if they're wet, they can bring out the color a little bit more. I also use a polarizer in those kind of scenes. I'm often using a polarizer with these detailed shots, because it takes care of some of that glare, some of that reflection that the rocks are giving off.
So David, with some of your images, we're talking about the abstract where it's hard to tell what it is. One that really stuck out in your collection, I remember when you posted it on Facebook, is the rusty boat with the scratches on the side. Can you tell me how you found that particular image?
I love harbors. I love ghost towns. I love abstracts. And abstract photography has been around a long, long time. And so this is nothing new. Strand did it. Stieglitz did it with his equivalents. Steichen also did it. So there are a lot of abstract photographers in the history of photography. But I love those rusty scenes. And that's why I like ghost towns so much. That particular image you were talking about, in the harbor scenes, I look for the boats that basically are the garbage scows in the harbor. So just the ones that are the worse they look, the better they are for me to photograph. And I look for those.
Agree more.
I kind of look where the water line is, or where the boat is abutting a pier or something and scraping. And if you look for those kind of areas on a boat, then in those kind of boats, then you'll find almost Jackson Pollock-like paintings on them. And in ghost towns, I'm looking for rusty cars. I'm looking for rusty old gas stations and metals. And there's always something to pay attention to. As in one ghost town, there was an old billboard there, and the billboard was probably 30 feet by 20 feet. And I just found a place that was about 6 inches by 3 inches and zoomed in on that one little area. And again, an abstract. And I was looking for uh, basically as what I look for in details, some of the color, some of the lines, some of the texture, some of the form. I look for uh, how much negative space is there that's available. So there's a lot of things I look for in abstract photography. It doesn't isn't nature per se, but
Mhm.
it is nature taking over man-made objects. So rust.
Yes, I agree on the rust. I love the rust, and you're spot on with it. Really is nature in a sense, because nature is the one doing the destruction, really, right? Of the elements. Um, and to add to, I agree with everything you're saying. The other piece too around all of those type of abstracts, similar to what we find, say, in the boat docks and other areas. Um, is just the layers. So you get different layers of color and texture. Like maybe a boat was painted 5 or 6 times over the years, and
Yeah.
it chips away over time, and you see these different patterns and layers that you don't normally get with maybe other scenarios out, say, in nature by itself.
Yeah, when you and I were doing that workshop in Oregon for abstract photography, there was an old rail car that we visited, and
Yep.
the layers on that and how the paint was peeling away and the rust was coming out, but it had been painted a few times, and it was just gorgeous. It was just absolutely gorgeous. And those are things that are fun to find in more urban environments. They don't have to be out per se, but there's a lot to be found in urban environments too. I know that you do well with rocks, large boulders, I mean, and looking at the lichens. So it's not rust, but in a way it kind of is, but it's a lichen that's forming on top of a rock. And you get some wonderful abstract patterns there if you want to talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I definitely I like seeking that out, and that is I have a particular image where chaos is really the strong suit of that image and is what I was after. A lot of times we're looking to minimize that, and we don't want a chaotic image, but in this particular case, I wanted something, and I called it paint splatter because of all the lichen that all spread across the top of the rock. And it was one of those things, again, where I'm looking down. So I had to search all around the landscape to find something and literally stand on top of the rocks, shooting straight down
Mm-hmm.
for that particular image with, a 70 millimeter just zoomed into a small little space. So I'm looking often. So that particular shot that, we're talking about is more just the chaotic one. But other times I'm looking for patterns, where you see different splotches, and those different splotches, often I'm looking for spacing. And that's another thing I don't know if we've talked too much about. And I know you have some images that represent that really well too. But in an abstract sense, or even the art in nature, a lot of times the different elements that we want in the image, what makes one compelling versus another one not as compelling might be simply just the spacing. And is there even space between them that balances the image out? Can make a big difference.
Yeah, you have that one called Leopard's Back, I think it's called, that you have.
Oh yeah, the desert lizard. Yeah, I think.
Okay,
Yeah,
that's
yeah, you were close.
okay. And all of it, I look at mud and look for that spacing. And it's just some wonderful things to look for just by looking at the ground, looking at how things are breaking, looking at how those colors are spaced. You and I were hiking in the desert Southwest, and something that's fun to shoot there is using the bounce light. So when we're photographing in the shade and the light is hitting the side of the cliff and bouncing into the shade and illuminating some of that cracked mud. And you and I are just having a field day in there doing detail shots, abstracts, just looking at cracked mud. And I can spend my day doing that. So
Yeah,
talk about
I
that.
couldn't agree more. Well, and the thing is too, I have a series of images that you may have seen where I photographed cracked mud on one, like 3 or 4 day trip, all in the same area, and they're all substantially different images. So different colors, different texture. So there's so much you can do with something like that that just can greatly vary just even in the same location, which makes it exciting because it's not like you just go there, take one photo, and you're done.
Right. Some of the things that I look for in abstracts too, time, I think, can help with an abstract image, especially with water. I look for reflections coming down the water if the water's in the shade and the cliff is reflecting down. Time, just by using a quarter second or a second without water flowing by, can create some wonderful subjects with light and color. I look for abstracts with my telephoto, like you said earlier with a forest. I love sand dunes for that. Zooming into a sand dune and shooting, and or using a macro and focusing on something extremely small to create an abstract. I also, for abstract, I look for minimalism. I incorporate that into my photography a lot anyway, because I think minimalism makes for an interesting image. And I often use a telephoto for my minimalist images. One I can remember grasses that I photograph along the Deschutes River in Oregon, or also in the Yellow Mountains in China, photographing some of the patterns and layers of the land is a way to make a more minimalist image.
Some of your images that stand out that are very interesting as well also deal with panning and multiple exposures. Do you want to talk a little bit about those techniques or how you go about that?
Sure. It helps simplify and helps blend some of those colors by panning. And when I pan a photo, you can do a horizontal pan by taking your camera and moving it this way while you're shooting, or a vertical pan by obviously going up and down. So some of the things I look for are clean shapes and patterns that will nicely blend. I look at the color and how those will nicely blend together. And it really depends how a person moves as to how quickly they need to pan. So I may be doing a slower pan at times or a faster pan, just depending on how I feel that day. Also with panning, you have to follow through. If you are anticipating the click of your shutter and not following through, like a golf swing or a hockey player or something like that, who follows through. If you're not following through, then you'll see this this little kind of jitter step in the image itself that won't look that attractive. So keep it clean and follow through. But on the Oregon coast, I like to pan a lot. If there's some nice color on the beach, some nice color in the sky, and then you have that blue ocean in between, you get a nice clean pan with that. And the forest, for those vertical pans, I'm often in the forest scene and doing some of those vertical panning. Again, a good way by utilizing time to create abstract images. So multiple exposure, I think you asked about too. A lot of cameras have multiple exposure functions on it, and what I often do is to try to photograph something clean, like maybe a wall. And if I find a wall with some interesting color, and then found another wall with some interesting color and maybe peeling paint on it, then I put those two colors together, and then I might photograph a pot of flowers on top of that and create an abstract conglomeration of images. What I like to do is have total control on those multiple exposure images. The camera can do it for you, but I like to have total control. So what I do, if I'm doing 4 images, then I underexpose by 2 stops. I take the square root of how many images I'm taking and underexpose by that many. A lot of cameras, you can expose up to 9 images on its own. And if I was going to do all 9, then I'd underexpose by 3 stops, and then my exposure should come out just about right.
That's great. Yeah, well, you definitely know what you're doing with that, David. I've seen some great images that you captured from a panning perspective, as well as the double exposure, and I know you cover those both well in the workshops that we've done together too.
Thanks. And when we're out together, a lot of times we also look at boat reflections. We talked about the harbor scenes and looking at the rust, but reflections offer an amazing amount of abstract possibilities. And so we've both done some of that. I know a reflection shot of yours that has some nice red and green. Again, that kind of yin and yang approach that you have, playing those colors off of each other. Do you want to tell me a little bit about that too?
Yes, I know which image you're talking about. The one that I took in a harbor, and it's got some green mossy pilings and a red building in the background. What was really pulling me in for that image was the lines. You had different lines that were within the red building in the background. And then the pilings were basically all this mossy green. So you had the red and the green contrasting, but they were both vertical lines. And what I liked was the reflection that had just a little bit of movement in the water, just enough to give a little bit of, an artistic or painterly feel to it without it being so much that you couldn't tell what it is. But it's enough when you look at it, you're trying to figure out, what am I looking at? And that's the key. What I like with some of these images is it makes you think for, even if it's just a couple seconds, trying to figure out what it is, or is the image turned upside down, or is it sideways, or what is it? That is always interesting and fun to work with, to see what you can make out of an image that way.
I agree, and I especially agree with what you said about the water. And if there's too much commotion in the water, then if there's too much commotion in the water, then it just doesn't work so well. So I look for water that's kind of soft too, gives a good reflection. And if the sun's up a little higher, you get stronger and better reflections too. That's a good time to look for those. So early in the morning, probably not a good time. 10 in the morning, probably a better time to look for those boat reflections. And there's people that actually create their abstract work too, and you can do that. In class, we create our own abstracts by using a lot of different things. I know Man Ray, if you look at some of his photos, he explored futurism, and he did a lot of abstract imagery with that. And also there's a guy named Alvin Coburn who also went the abstract route, but he made his own lens. He made a lens made of all this different glass that would give a cubist feel to the shot that he took. So there's different ways to go about abstract photography. Don't have to go as crazy as that one guy did, but there are different ways to do abstract photography. But the best way to approach it is to experiment, to have fun, and don't be afraid of failure, because you're going to screw up a lot, but it's just a lot of fun, and you learn from it and you get better at it by doing it.
Fully agree with that.
Yeah. So I guess that's about all I have to say today on abstract photography, unless you want to add anything more. So for next time, take care, and I'll see you around, Adrian. Nice chatting with you.
Nice chatting with you as well, David. Look forward to our next outing, whenever that will be.
Okay. Adios.
Adios.